I hope you're ready to dive into our third panel, which is Survivor Girls, Trauma, Time and Memory. First off, a little bit of housekeeping though, just a reminder to, if you're not one of our panelists, keep your cameras and your microphones turned off while the panel is taking place. And while we are loving that everyone's using the chat to share their thoughts and theories, do remember to hold on to any questions that you have for our panelists for when we open the Q&A section at the end of the panel. I'm pretty sure all our panelists are here. So just a little reminder for them, please do try to keep to time. What I will do is, if you keep an eye on your screen, I'll pop up briefly on the video when you have 5 minutes to go and sort of do that. And then I'll pop up when you've got 2 minutes to go and do that. Our first speaker is Moshaty, who is a cognitive behavioural therapist and author, and whose paper is entitled Yellowjackets, a study on society's labelling of victims of survival. So whenever you're ready, Mo, I'll take my video off and you can tell us all about it.
Thank you so much, Shellie. I'm very excited to be here. This is such a wonderful symposium, and even reading through the abstracts, I really wanted to preface this talk with the appreciation on how well and deftly and delicate you've all been so far in describing and dissecting trauma within those abstracts. It's not an easy task in any arena, and especially within horror or psychological horror, it can get kind of dicey, but just looking at the topics, it's been absolutely wonderful. So as Shellie had said, I am a cognitive behavioral therapist. My concentration is in PTSD in women. I am also a assault survivor counselor as well. So I see a lot of survivor trauma in my work. And I'm also a horror screenwriter and a horror author. So melding these two together has been a really nice treat for me, especially with this show that's been so informative for me at this age. I graduated in 1996, so it's really throwing me back into that era, especially musically. And I am so excited to see back at those the music papers as well, because it's so joyous. But a little bit about me, just to preface, to get into the subject that I'm talking about today, is I am a co-founder of Nyx Horror Collective. So we are a diverse group of women identifying creators that work to celebrate and elevate women-led horror. So we had our first film festival on the Shudder channel, and they're partnering with us again this year, which is really, really awesome. So we're giving a lot of women identifying creators a platform to not only share their films, but their experiences, and marrying this, like I said, with my therapy background is just fantastic. So I wanted to speak today about how society tends to view victims of trauma or victims of a horrific event. So in survivorship, we tend to categorize victims, like let's take Yellowjackets, for example, isolation trauma. You have environmental entrapment. You have Stockholm syndrome, which we kind of have a taste of in the beginning, in the intro. And it plays out very smoothly. But as a society, we have a tendency to immediately classify who is worthy of our sympathy and who is not. We put them in two buckets very immediately based on their story. And as things play out, they kind of deviate from either from one into another or vice versa. So we've seen victims of tragedies and horrific events be scrutinized after they've been rescued, relieved, or found alive. Their pasts have been delved into, their reputations and character called into question, their present becomes disorienting and uninhabitable. So for what? Basically because society doesn't believe that their rescue or their journey was exactly what we needed or what we hoped for, because maybe their ending was just a little too neat or rather too ambiguous for us. Or was there something in particular that these victims did to deserve their fate? So this is the scrutiny that we see Shauna, Natalie, Misty, and Thaisa face. So why is this important to me when we're speaking to reactivity? We see in all of these women as adults a heightened sense of awareness, which is a natural and normal trauma response. But I'll elaborate on each character's personal bout with it in just a bit. But in this response, we see the view of the victim kaleidoscope, and the trauma becomes less important to the public. And what's important to their public is how it affects them and what they can learn or delve into more to find the truth. So how do we classify victims? How do we make victims feel victims of trauma through society? How do we admonish them? How do we celebrate them? Most times, often not, we admonish more than we celebrate. And we don't want necessarily say that they don't have help that they don't have rescue, but as society, we're very, very quick to really negate an experience. So if they're hyper aware, or if the victim is too guarded, they can't let what happened to them go, right? If they're hyper vigilant or they're oversensitive, they're acting crazy. If they're withdrawn, they're letting it affect them too much. And if they engage in escapist behavior as a means of numbing and incoming emotion, they don't want to face their problems. So what we've created for our victims here is a hamster wheel with no way out. You're damned if you do, or you're damned if you don't. So for our four musketeers here, as adults, their characters are damned, straight up, no chaser. The public wants to know why and by what means they survived. And judging by the whispers and speculation of 25 years later, I think we can all agree that the hero's welcome quickly faded. So I want to go into how each woman faces their trauma, or what their response is, and how different it is, and how important it is for that to be seen in media. So for Shauna, as an adult, we see her hyper-awareness in the vein of what we call de-escalation. She always finds a way, quite stoically and most times dutifully, to get ahead of the fray or sort things out. She knows what needs to be done and will stop at nothing to protect the other three, but also trying to keep that delicate balance of the status quo of her quiet and unassuming suburban lifestyle, which is a sharp turn from that huntress we saw in the wilderness. And it's instinctual. It goes into overdrive, much like her carving the rabbit for the stew, and poor Adam for that matter. Taking the societal aspect down from 30,000 feet, the natural reaction of Jackie's parents is an air of a not so well hidden, why are you here and not my daughter? Which is a normal reaction, but you can tell for Shauna, it's become old hat. She's used to the emotional abuse of that. So for them, her trauma is getting in the way of their grieving. Now, Natalie is more of a hypersensitive escapist. We see right off the top that in her introduction in the show, that she's in a recovery center and utilizing drugs and alcohol at an early age, which is a trauma response from a physical and emotional abuse from her father and also his violent death. Natalie already enters that wilderness with her baggage already quite full. The extreme violence, death, and implied cannibalism that occurs there only deepens her dependability on substances, and she makes it work for her. When she discovers Travis has died or perhaps was murdered, she muzzles the pain with her first beer outside of rehab. So taking the societal aspect in the one-on-one interaction, with Kevin, Natalie won't skip over the traumatic events that she's experienced and go backwards to when Kevin and her cared for each other. Why isn't she moving on, according to Kevin? Now, how Misty manages it, Miss Misty. I absolutely love talking about this character because she is so intricate and played incredibly by Christina Ricci. There's so many, I feel like we've all in our lives run into a Misty, some point in our lives, and there's somewhere on the Misty spectrum. But for me, Misty, and really just to qualify this strictly as a response, but we see there's a little bit of that peppered into before she heads to the wilderness, in the wilderness, and in adulthood, we see it escalating of hyperdiligence psychopath. So is that extreme? Is it extreme to call Misty a psychopath? You tell me. For all intents and purposes, young Misty kind of comes off as a misfit toy, right? She wants to belong. She wants to fit in. She's eager to please. But after the crash, she is literally patient zero for all the havoc, danger, and violence that later occurs. She breaks the black box. She makes the decision to save Coach Ben's leg. She's a collective psychotropic mushroom wrangler. She's really trying to take charge in small rumblings. And as an adult, Misty is still that wolf in sheep's clothing. You know, she's charming, but she's still a master manipulator. And where we kind of bridge that gap between psychopath and sociopath, she does not have what we call the absolute rage of a sociopath. Psychopath is very calculated. They're very narcissistic. They're very manipulative. And she does this quite well, even within the group and the people that kind of orbit it. Her handiwork with Jessica, not to mention, you know, disposing of poor Adam, is extreme diligence to reactivity. She has a guy for everything. She has an answer for everything, a tool and a plan for everything. She's 10 steps ahead of absolutely everyone. So societally, Misty is still very much an outcast to the rest of the group. Her coworkers barely acknowledge her. and her dates are uneased by her. She's just too much for everyone. And judging by the smile in the pilot, where she lifts the bearskin mask, I have to ask if that is a wrong assumption for Misty. Now, Thaisa is a bit of a 180. Thaisa's track for her trauma response is dissociative or avoidant. You can tell in the pilot how much of a perfectionist she is, especially with the poor leg break-in incident, but she also strives to be much of that in her adulthood. She seeks to leave the Yellowjacket saga behind her by any means necessary. You know, we look at Thaisa and her life is very charmed. Her wife is beautiful. Her son is endearing at first. Her home is immaculately styled, and she's headed towards a seat in public office. Appearances are particularly important to her. And having what happened in the wilderness kept a secret is also incredibly important. So after all, Thaisa hires Jessica to keep that buried, right? So as an adult, Thaisa begins to unravel further with each step into the election, with each step of growing closer to the force she tried to kind of keep this really arm's length reach away from. And on a societal view, especially in that cannibalistic campaign ad, the public pangs to know exactly what hidden monster lurks underneath all that designing clothing. It was too neat and too tidy of an ending for the public, especially when she encounters the woman who's trying to fund her campaign. So for me, as a screenwriter and as a therapist, as an author as well, why is this so important to me to really kind of delve into these disorders and these trauma responses? We've all seen really terrible tropes for women in horror movies, especially psychological horror movies too. The twisted ankle with the monster 10 feet behind her, or the woman that tries to tell all of you that there is a monster or a ghost or a revenant somewhere in the house, but nobody believes her. But especially in psychological horror such as this, it's important to get the reactivity piece right. Each of these women are shown fully formed, all possessing their own agency. There's no gaslighting, no roads that go nowhere, no fridging, nowhere here. They're all dealing with their personal trauma in very different and very particular ways. And on top of that, they have to manage a collective trauma between all of them. And that's a bonding piece, whether they like it or not. And it was handled really well in this instance in Yellowjackets, because those of us that are on the trauma maintenance, which is really actively working towards better emotional reactivity every day, we need to see that in media. We need to see that our reactions aren't made up to drive the plot. And even in those reactions, that is recovery. And I think as someone who writes in the literature space and television space, we need to be more responsible about how we portray mental health. And forgive me if I'm being very targeted here, especially women's mental health. Art is the post that society leans on for information, whether it's a fabricated fantasy or a factual documentary. So the onus is really on the research, the consulting, the behind the scenes work that goes into crafting an honest character, no matter how ugly it can get. And I think that if we can change the narrative of how we view trauma in all its forms of media and beyond, maybe we will stop trying to devalue and best each other. And I think we're all guilty of trying to win the gold medal in the trauma Olympics. We've all had it worst. What about me? But in all seriousness and all honesty, Yellowjackets did a fabulous job of showcasing what it is to build a dimensional, flawed woman dealing with trauma without shame. And shame is a huge umbrella that's been cast solely to women's mental health in media. And I think if we can all take a page out of that playbook, we will stop being the society that always searches for the hidden monster. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I want to pick your brains about Misty later on because she fascinates me as well. Thank you. All right, so our second speaker today is Simon Bowie. Simon is a culture writer and film critic. His writing on television includes a book on time and trauma in contemporary television and several conference presentations on Twin Peaks and Twin Peaks: The Return. He has an MA in Cultural and Critical Studies from Birkbeck, University of London, and Simon's paper is titled Only Time, Time and Trauma in Yellowjackets. So whenever you're ready, Simon.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Mo, that was terrific. I hope I can talk about trauma as sensitively as you did, but I will note the following content warnings on the slide, so please do protect yourselves. So yeah, Yellowjackets' first episode, season 1, episode 1, is bookended by moments of trauma spanning the past and the present. The show opens in the narrative's past with an as yet unidentified young woman, although there's been some speculation in the chat today, an as yet unidentified young woman fleeing from hidden pursuers in the forest before falling into a punji pit. A voiceover from the narrative's present transitions the scene to 2021, with a succession of scenes where investigative journalist Jessica interviews people who knew the Yellowjackets team who were lost in the wilderness. The pilot episode ends with scenes cross-cutting between the past and the present. We see unidentified figures in the wilderness consume the body of the young woman killed in the opening scene, intercut with present-day New Jersey, where we see Misty abusing one of her patients and Shauna reading her diary from the wilderness. The episode ends by cutting from present-day Shauna to past Shauna in the traumatizing plane crash that left the young women stranded in the wilderness. Throughout the series, Yellowjackets continues to use this structure of cross-cutting between the characters' past in 1996 and the characters' present in 2021. So in this presentation, I want to argue that Yellowjackets uses this structure to represent how the characters' time perception has been distorted by their trauma and by their PTSD, such that the past and the present overlap for the traumatized young women. The traumatic past is always present in some sense for them. By doing this, Yellowjackets ties itself into a legacy of using depictions of non-linear time to represent specifically the trauma of women, and that this feeds into ongoing discussions around time-informed approaches to PTSD treatment. So time and trauma have a complex relationship. Traumatic events such as a plane crash can distort what Lenore C. Tur refers to as the time perception of the traumatized person. And Tur refers to time perception as the conscious and perhaps unconscious sensory experience of time. Psychic trauma and PTSD can result in a disrupted perception of linear time. In one study of traumatized children and adults, Tur found that 26 participants out of 30 displayed various malfunctions of time perception, including alterations in the perception or memory of time duration, confusion in sequencing, or in orienting themselves in time. The present-day women in Yellowjackets display various symptoms of PTSD and trauma, as Mo has outlined for us in the previous presentation. Following their traumatizing plane crash and subsequent survival experience in the North American wilderness, they exhibit disturbing thoughts and dreams, increased fight or flight response, and intentional self-harm. At the end of the pilot episode, when the show flows from Shauna reading her diary to Shauna on the plane about to crash, we're seeing a representation of a disruption in the typical time-memory relationship, which Leah Wise-Altsman associates specifically with PTSD. The show inhabits both past and present simultaneously in a way that mirrors, in Tur's terms, the malfunctioning of time perception. The show, like the women, distorts the experience of linear time, and events fall out of chronology as memories overlap between the past and the present. Feminist theorist Karen Barad reads Hayashi Kyoko's work through this same lens of time and trauma. Hayashi was a hibakusha, a Japanese survivor of the USA detonating atomic bombs in Japan, and specifically of the Nagasaki bombing on 9th of August 1945, which she experienced at just 14 years old. In her novella, From Trinity to Trinity, Hayashi recounts her journey to the Trinity site in New Mexico. She seeks to understand her trauma by traveling to the location where nuclear weaponry, the source of her trauma, entered the world. As in Yellowjackets, Hayashi's narrative jumps from past to present and back again in a disjointed way that reflects her lived experience of a life rendered non-linear by trauma. Ayako Hotake, Hayashi's translator, describes this. In an attempt to reflect both the continuity and the unevenness of time, Hayashi's narration does not maintain a linear structure. In her stories, past and present are not only related, they are intricately united. The lives of both the dead and the living interact. Memories and premonitions are just vessels that travel between past, present, and future. Yellowjackets' narration also doesn't maintain a linear structure. The pilot episode starts and ends with past moments at the peak of their characters' trauma. living through a plane crash and adopting horrifying hunting practices and ritualistic cannibalism. The past and the present are intricately united through psychic trauma and PTSD. These peaks of trauma are always present for the young women, and the show makes them immediately present for us, the audience, by presenting them as our introduction to the story. Similarly, Hayashi is always, in some sense, present at the moment that the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. In this passage, looking at an exhibit panel in the National Atomic Museum in New Mexico, Hayashi's experience flits between the present and the past moment of trauma that changed her life. Hayashi is both in front of a panel in the museum and in the past, separating trash in the factory she worked in when the bomb was dropped. Hayashi experiences the Nagasaki bombing as a traumatic event so significant that it draws everything else in her life towards it like a black hole. And by thrusting us directly into the peak of its character's trauma, Yellowjackets depicts the same disruption of time perception, where everything's brought back to the plane crash and the horrors that ensued. Hayashi achieves this in a literary way by introducing something that happened in the past with the past tense, then with the same paragraph shifting into the present tense, as if with some small trigger from daily life, the narrator suddenly remembers and relives scenes from her childhood, from August 9th or from the days subsequent to the atomic attack. Yellowjackets achieves the same effect in a cinematic register through its cross-cutting and overlapping scenes of past and present, and by placing equal weight on its past and present narratives. Yellowjackets' representation of time and trauma can be further emphasized by contrasting its flashback structure with the superficially similar structure of Lost, another TV series which has been mentioned today about the survivors of a plane crash and their subsequent struggle for survival. Lost also made heavy use of flashbacks to structure each episode, but in contrast to the seamless flow from past to present and back in Yellowjackets, Lost tended to signal the start and end of each flashback with a distinctive whoosh sound effect, which delineates the flashback scenes as structurally separate to the present day scenes. Even when Lost complicates its chronology with flash forwards and then actual time travel for a couple of seasons, the show always signals narrative disruptions to linear time with structural cues like sound effects or hard cuts. Despite the surface similarities to Lost structure, Yellowjackets is closer to Hayashi's style of temporal distortion. Barad distinguishes the travel hopping of Hayashi's non-linear time to that of time travel narratives like Lost, where the protagonists are autonomous unified subjects who continue to live in the time of their present while returning to a past that once was. Yellowjackets flashbacks to 1996 flow seamlessly into scenes of the 2021 present day, often using overlapping voiceover from previous scenes and cross-cutting between past and present to represent what Barad calls the undoing of time, of universal time, of the notion that moments exist one at a time, everywhere the same, and replace one another in succession. A good example of this flow is in the last episode of the season, season 1, episode 10, when Shauna, Thaisa, Natalie, and Misty attend their high school reunion and are shown a memorial presentation for the victims of the wilderness. Enya's song Only Time plays diegetically over the PowerPoint in 2021 and continues playing non-diegetically over a scene in 1996 as Lottie leads a ritualistic prayer to the ancient gods of the sky and the dirt. There's no sound effect separating past from present as in Lost. There's no explicit cue to show that the narrative is cross-cutting between time periods. The presenter at the reunion announces that in order to look forward, we must first look back. And the cross-cutting between the past and the present makes it clear that looking back isn't necessary for the survivors. The past is always present for them. Otake writes of Hayashi that on the same page, or even within the same paragraph, the narrator can simultaneously be the child who is experiencing the bombing and the adult who is writing about it decades later. And we see the same thing in Yellowjackets, simultaneously showing us the teenager living through a traumatizing situation and the adult living with the effects of that trauma. Lost also doesn't specifically deal with trauma, whereas Yellowjackets very clearly shows the lingering effects of trauma on its characters and how this is specifically women's trauma. As well as the show's starkly different tone, Lost's flashbacks don't take the characters back to a moment of trauma. The central traumatic event, the crash of Oceanic Airlines Flight 815, happens in the show as present, with flashbacks used to impart background information on the show's characters, and often with no relation to trauma or PTSD. Yellowjackets, however, is specifically about women's trauma. One of the show's creators, Ashley Lyle, talking about the show to Danielle Turciano, said that trauma is just a fact of life to some extent, particularly for women. And so we really wanted to get personal as opposed to clinical and explore it that way. By depicting women's trauma using depictions of non-linear time, Yellowjackets ties into a legacy of exploring women's trauma in this way. Hayashi herself was a woman whose work was influenced by her unhappy marriage to an incestuous man. But we also see similar depictions of non-linear time and trauma in Pablo Larraín's films dealing with women's trauma, Jackie and Spencer. In Jackie, scenes from Jacqueline Kennedy's past flow directly into scenes of her in the film's present, being interviewed by a journalist. The journalist interviewing her reminds Jackie of her traumatizing past, and the film represents how her PTSD disrupts her time perception by showing past and present seamlessly flowing into one another and overlapping. As Barad writes of Hayashi, chronology has no place. Multiple temporalities present themselves without any one of them being present, disassembling the allegedly determinate distinction between individual and collective, memory and history. Jackie specifically ties Jacqueline Kennedy's trauma with her identity as a woman. The final scene of her interring the coffins of her stillborn children reveals that her trauma is not just from the assassination of her husband, but from the often overlooked and often hidden trauma of miscarriage. Similarly, in a sequence in Spencer, after a stressful weekend at Sandringham, Diana Spencer escapes to her childhood home, and we see discontinuous flashes from throughout her life as the trauma of her unhappy marriage and her unacknowledged eating disorder trigger a PTSD response, disordering her time perception. Diana's past and present blur into one another as she runs faster and faster to escape her trauma. Spencer also disrupts linear time with the ghost of Anne Boleyn, haunting Diana to represent how structures of power have used and traumatized women throughout history. Yellowjackets ties into this legacy of depicting women's trauma through non-linear time and expands the cultural conversation around ongoing discussions of PTSD. Clinical psychiatrist Jessie Gold writes that Yellowjackets is about exploring how these different women manifest their trauma and PTSD in different ways. And as I've argued, it does this partly by representing the fractured and non-linear time perception that psychologists like Ter and Saltzman argue trauma can cause, particularly for women. In so doing, Yellowjackets fits into ongoing discussions about the nature of PTSD and PTSD treatment. Saltzman identifies a body of literature in the psychology community arguing that PTSD be reclassified as a disorder of time and advocating time-informed approaches to PTSD treatment. So Yellowjackets, along with films like Pablo Larraín's, visualizes this approach to PTSD through its representation of trauma-induced nonlinear time perception. And it opens up this perspective on women's trauma for a new and perhaps wider cultural audience. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that. Okay, our next speaker is Shelagh Rowan-Legg. Shelagh is a filmmaker, writer, programmer for Fright Fest and Wench Film Festival, a contributing editor for Screen Anarchy, and the executive director of the Miskatonic Institute of Horror Studies. Her book, The Spanish Fantastic: Contemporary Filmmaking in Horror, Fantasy and Sci-Fi, was published in 2016. And Shelagh's going to talk to us about Girls Who Run with Wolves, a topography of survival in Yellowjackets. And I'm hoping Shelagh's here and ready to go.
Can people see me as well?
Yep, can see you.
Okay, great, because I can't see myself. It's a bit odd. And I will share my screen now. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So thank you very much to the team for inviting me. I am such a fan of this show and have so much to say about it. My paper is going to mostly concentrate on the 1996 timeline when the girls are in the wilderness. I think I have a longer paper in me to do more of a comparative study, but this is what I ended up following for this particular talk. Now, at the end of episode 6 of the Yellowjackets season 1, as the survivors of the plane crash look at the rotting insides of the only deer they've been able to hunt for days, Tysa says that she's tired of waiting for rescue. She declares her intention to hike south, even though that could, of course, possibly put her in greater danger. Now, if she or any of the others took a moment to think about where they were, their location, presumably one of them would have a reasonable idea of where they crashed in the Canadian Rockies. She would know that it would be better for her actually to hike to the east or west. She would have a better chance of getting rescue much faster. South is just going to keep her in the mountains. But keeping aside their lack of their geographical knowledge, where they are in this wilderness is not only a literal, terrible, desolate space, but a liminal space between life and death, between childhood and adulthood, between a weakness caused by the plane crash and what we will see through the first season as they're growing power. We see, of course, what happens to them 25 years after this crash, but this time frame of the 1996 of the crash and the immediate months afterwards, we witness the topography that they create over this first season within that liminal space, a sort of topography that is warped by their experiences both before and during this time. Now, in their book, Dead Blondes and Bad Mothers, Sadie Doyle writes, "From the beginning, we've known that a woman who leaves society as we know it, who heads out to the dark and threatening spaces beyond the world we've built, will find not her death, but her power." Now, while the Yellowjackets' exclusion from society as they know it and their presence in the wilderness is involuntary, they will indeed find death, and they will also actually find power. The topography of their minds is, in a sense, warped as they go from suburb to wilderness, from a place teeming with artificiality, constant human interaction, and overflowing stimuli, to a space of the natural, and as we were discovering, perhaps supernatural. The topography of the places and spaces that we inhabit as humans are mirrored in the topography of our minds. And in the space where there is little human activity, that topography can become inflected by human interference that will shape nature to its will. Or perhaps, as we're seeing in this show, nature is shaping the Yellowjackets to its will. Now, if we first think about where the Yellowjackets have come from, New Jersey, close enough to New York that, it's mentioned several times in the show, they can take a train into the city, yet their New Jersey is a world unto itself, with its particular identity. Early in episode 1, we're shown various images of that topography. I don't know a lot of the specific locations, but I'm guessing something of Atlantic City, the Jersey Shore, and these suburbs or bedroom towns where they live. As written on the representation of this type of location is seen in film and television. While neither a backward rural backwater nor a hectic cutthroat metropolis, the suburb is not simply a location for the lassitude of middle age and the middle class either. One could argue that the topography of the suburb, its existence, is the most opposed to what the girls will encounter in the wilderness. If you live in a city or you live in a rural area, you're taught to always be on the lookout for danger, but the suburbs are seen as a safe space, at least in theory. And of course, this is the America of the mid-1990s. The Cold War is over. 9/11 is years away. The internet is only just beginning to become available in people's homes, and the slogan of the day, originating from punk band Bikini Kill and then popularized by the Spice Girls, is Girl Power. It became the motto of young women around the world. And of course, we have to remember that social media, Facebook, Twitter, did not exist at this time. But even within this topography of the 1990s teenage girl, there are, of course, differences brought on by personality and circumstance. You have Shauna, who's a typical middle-class straight-A student, poised to attend a top university. There's Tysa, who has boundless ambition and is determined to take on the world and do so openly as a Black queer woman. Misty you know, as people have talked about, Misty is probably the most fascinating character, given that she sort of starts to embrace her identity in the wilderness as the outcast weirdo, and that doesn't necessarily change all that much in the future. Natalie is weighed down by her circumstances, being a poor kid. And as she says later, she's the one who seems least able, apart from Travis, to cope with her trauma. And I think we should also include, if we're talking, as I am, about the 96 time frame, Jackie in this. Jackie, who comes from money, who comes from rich family, parents who worship her, as we get to know. Her future topography, in a sense, is mapped out clearly. Had she survived, she certainly would have had material comfort, if no other kind of comfort. But then Yellowjackets is not a typical cabin in the woods or film or show. Where they are is truly the middle of nowhere. Even the one spot of civilization that can be found, that they find, the cabin, is only accessible by plane. And we don't know if, pardon me, anyone else knows of this cabin's existence. As I said, this is the opposite of where the girls have come from. And like the characters in Lost, they've been stranded by a plane crash. However, unlike those characters, they don't have nice warm weather. They don't have an ocean full of fish or a woods full of boar that at least, you know, keeps starvation or freezing to death at bay. Those are real concerns for these characters. So we have to think then, what will become of this topography now that these humans have found a place to claim it? Donald Melby writes, the mere presence of humankind makes an otherwise mute landscape speak, and the language of each landscape is idiosyncratic to the body or nation of people in a position to confront it. What we know so far of this space is that at least one human has existed in it for some time. We don't know if they intended to make that isolation permanent because of the plane. And the symbols that we see, the circle, the triangle, seems to be a female figure that we see on trees and on various spots. We don't know if those symbols were carved by this human or perhaps by another force, a force that seemingly seems to be keeping the girls trapped within this space. Now, in their work on fairy tales, Christina Kennedy, Tiana Kennedy, and Melissa Kennedy point out, in many fairy tales, the landscape, the ugly reality that the hero or heroine must struggle through with or overcome, can be seen as an antagonist. We certainly have a clue to this from the first episode's opening scene. The landscape is an antagonist to this particular girl who ends up being killed and then presumably eaten. And presumably there were others who were disposed of in this manner. As we know, only, or as we believe, only 8 survived and returned from the wilderness. So at first, this landscape is an antagonist, of course, due to the weather, due to the lack of readily available food. But its topography has also been altered by these humans inhabiting it, altered for their benefit. The landscape becomes, over the course of the 19 months that the girls are stranded, in a sense, a protagonist to the survivors. This shift of the wilderness as a place of danger to a place of safety for a select number of these girls suggests an imposition of this new topography, that of the girls onto this landscape, of how they decided to confront this antagonistic space and layer upon it a life of survival. Indeed, not necessarily survival, just survival, but a life with its own culture and ritual, a topography that grew out of necessity, out of minds of girls growing into power. And of course, these are girls, these are teenagers with varying levels of experience in both personal matters and with the wilderness they must inhabit. Of course, you know, we know that men are there, but as others have pointed out, the men don't really have control over this situation. Now, in writing on the nature of space and place, theorist Wee Fu Tuan noted, if we think of space as that which allows movement, then place is pause. Each pause in movement makes it possible for a space to be transformed into a place. So how will these girls then make this space their place? It is up to them to do it. It is their topography now being warped by the situation and the trauma that they are beginning to experience that will be mapped onto this landscape. In his book, Haunted, Leo Body writes, horror embodies a hidden culture, often rooted in past belief and superstition, that has been otherwise repressed by the daylight world of official society and culture. Now in Lost, and if we think of another similar survival show, The Walking Dead, those who are left to survive, those survivors who were left to fend for themselves, are always trying to recreate society as they knew it, create some semblance of order according to what they used to know. But on what are these girls basing their new topography? It seems to begin towards the end of the first season with Lottie. Now, we could argue that Lottie is now free of the repression caused by her medication, that her visions are the root of this new culture that they will embed on this landscape. At the end of the final episode, it is Lottie who literally and figuratively tames the savage beast at their door. It is she whose visions would seem to be guiding them to what were shown at the beginning of the first episode. If we think of Laura Lee, who is the sort of acceptable spiritual path, she represents Christianity, a particular kind of Christianity, of, I should say, American Christianity, a particular kind of, I'm not sure if she's Baptist, evangelical, it's never stated, but she embodies the sort of presumption of Christianity that exists within American culture. But then she's gone. If Laura Lee is the acceptable spiritual path and she is now dead, that means that Lottie's visions are untampered by that presumption of Christianity, by the acceptable spiritual path. And Lottie can then interpret these any way that she chooses to do, to map a new topography onto the space to have it become a place. So in this landscape is that then can we see this place, this space, as their initiation into womanhood. I mean, we can take it from a sexual perspective in that we know at least a few of them have their first sexual encounters here. Presumably in the next season or sometime, Shauna will birth her child, and that's certainly an initiation from girlhood to womanhood. It's also so the place where all of them, with the exception of Natalie, witness and commit their first violent acts. But of course, the real initiation, in a sense, comes in the 9th episode. Their homecoming is, as others have pointed out, a very apt name for this event. Some subconscious part of them must have accepted that this space is now their place. It is now their home. So they create their own homecoming, their own rite of passage, in drinking the homemade brew, in inadvertently eating the shrooms, in running, perhaps more accurately, not with the wolves, but as the wolves, and almost making Travis their first sacrifice. Body writes, the feeling of being overwhelmed, of experiencing something vastly larger than oneself. The urge to believe in an invisible power was not only part of the confrontation of the holy, but also could be experienced in the heart of nature. Lottie is having what could be called a secular version of religious awe, and now freed from the conventional Christian interpretation, she can find a new meaning that she and the Yellowjackets need to find in order to ensure their survival. Now, Body also notes that in the landscape of horror cinema, and we can extend this to television, landscape often isn't necessarily picturesque. There's often a danger that one needs to escape from, a monster that's coming after you. I'm sure we've all seen the horror movies, the monster running you after you in the woods, or the landscape could be the danger itself. But of course, as we learn from the opening episode, it's the girls who have become the monsters in the landscape. In Misfit Sisters, Sue Shore writes that women and girls are placed in scenarios which force them to demonstrate extraordinary capacities within themselves, providing an unparalleled degree of agency that they each acquire elements of monstrosity in breaking with conventions and are frequently ostracized within their communities. And as you know, we all know fairy tales serve some sort of morality tale against deviance. But of course, in the case of these girls lost in the woods, it is the deviants who end up surviving. Body writes further, horror most intrinsically develops its potential to show the essential artifice of social form, social consensus, and social relations, including the demonic side of the family, as well as the animal, instinctual, sexual self, under the tuxedo and top hats of respectability. Now, in the real world, and I can't remember which of the speakers before pointed this out as well, you know, back in New Jersey, Jackie would be the top of the proverbial heap. She is the rich girl. She is the captain of the soccer team. She's the most popular. She's got the gorgeous boyfriend. And yet that map of social construction doesn't mean anything in this wild. In the homecoming episode, she doesn't drink the homemade brew. She doesn't eat the drug stew. Throughout the series, she's been drawing the frustration of the others by her lack of initiative. She doesn't help to collect water or do anything else unless she's forced to. She certainly behaves very badly towards Shauna, and okay, maybe Shauna little deserved it by sleeping with Jackie's boyfriend. Jackie's automatic expectation of support and her determination to still be at the top of that social heap is met with resentment and anger. This is no longer Jackie's world. And she is not the queen. We know who the queen is going to be. Her isolation then leads to a literal and proverbial chilling death. At least in a sense, Laura Lee died trying to save everyone else. Laura Lee being one connection to the real world and Jackie being the other. But now, once Jackie and Laura Lee are gone, the monstrous can truly begin to appear. The possibility of the monstrous is not out there and exotic, but somehow inside and normal, waiting to be released, exists almost from the beginning of the modern horror story. The creators of Yellowjackets have cited, unsurprisingly, Lord of the Flies as an inspiration for their story. They wanted to explore what might happen if it was girls who were stranded as opposed to boys, playing with a stereotype that somehow women are more gentle, or more organized, or more supportive of each other. Now, it could be argued that this is what happens, just not in the way that we expect. The last 2 episodes of the first season show us the beginnings of this new society, one based on worship of the animalistic with Charlotte as its leader. We can compare the final shots in episode 9 with one from episode 1, Charlotte placing the raw bare heart at the hollow of the tree, her first acolytes behind her. And then the episode, remember episode 1, Charlotte in the center, we believe it's Charlotte, everyone around her, giving us the sense of the human presence as being unnatural. Where the monster transgressed the standards of the normal when it's its frequent amalgamation of the human and animal, of male and female, of the natural and artificial. The first appearance of the remaining Yellowjackets and Furs with their dirty mismatched clothes is something of that amalgamation. The act of cannibalism as represented in horror, as Bruce Kedwin writes, challenges the boundary between the self and the other by violating and confusing it, putting a human on each side of a subject. At one point, presumably, the girl we see running for her life in nothing but a nightgown was one of these fur-clad Yellowjackets sitting around a circle. Presumably, we'll find out whatever she said or did wrong that then moved her from subject to object. The trap into which she falls, of course, will not be marked on any topographical map, but it is part of that topography created by these deviants, these monsters in this space. And we see in the future, in the 25 years later, how the topography that was created in their survival has changed these women. Shauna, as somebody has pointed out, retreats into the domestic, going the complete opposite of what she was. Taissa also tries to ignore the topography created by the survival situation by going in the same direction. But of course, her ignoring it actually makes the beast come out more and more. Natalie can't ignore the topography created in survival mode and constantly turns to drink and drugs. Misty, she's the wild card. She seems to relish in it. And perhaps what we can say is Misty is the mirror image to Lottie, whereas Misty accepts the topography that was created when they were in the wilderness, but somehow lives something of a normal existence. Lottie, as we seem to understand by the end of season 1, perhaps did not. Now, one woman is a witch, a few are a coven, several are a pack. Now, unlike the traditional witch of folklore, these Yellowjackets are together, young, nubile, sexually charged, and ravenous. And at the end of this first season, a pack has formed. We don't know yet if there's something supernatural in the wilderness or if they have brought it with them through their imposition on the landscape. The topographical map the Yellowjackets lived in before, the suburbs, their school life, their homes, the soccer field, becomes twisted and grotesque in this wilderness. From the crash site to the lake to the cabin and back to the crash site, the places where they worship their nature god, trap their prey, prepare their catch, and consume, probably both animals and people. Their human imposition upon this nature becomes more entrenched than that of the skeleton they find. This is their new topography on which they live and in which they find their topography of monstrosity of survival. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much. All right, so our final paper today has perhaps one of my favourite titles, which is You Can Learn So Much About a Person by Going Through Their Personal Refuse. Misty Quigley, True Crime and Trauma. And our speaker is Helen Bowie. Helen is a writer, and they have written about structural inequality through the lens of pop culture for publications including Screen Queens, E to London and StarTrek.com. They're also the author of Exposition Ladies from Fly on the Wall Press that came out. Is that already out, Helen, or is that coming out?
Out in September.
Lovely, out in September. And that is a poetry pamphlet exploring unheard women in cinematic tropes. Whenever you're ready, please take it away.
Thank you. Let me just get my screen share going. Is that working?
Yeah, can see it.
Perfect, thank you. So yeah, I'm Helen Bowie. I am a writer and a very conflicted, sometimes true crime fan. I'm speaking about the relationship between the concept of the citizen detective, how that fits into wider true crime fandom, and how that relates to trauma in women, and specifically looking at Misty through this lens. So what is a citizen detective? Misty sums it up here.
Oh, we can't hear the clip, sorry.
Can you not hear the clip?
No, I think it's when you share the screen, you have to, there's a little box to tick for sound, but.
My laptop is playing up, so I'm going to just not share the clip because I think if I try to make it work, it will fall apart. So in Misty's words, a citizen detective is like a private investigator, except nobody hired them or asked for their help. Citizen detectives can take an active form, which is what Misty is describing here, but I'm also using this lens to encompass the wider communities that spring up around true crime media, and as groups that seek out stories which go beyond traditional media narratives or police reports, and these are demonstrated through Facebook groups, Crime Talk and other true crime fan communities. So to explore the relationship between true crime and Misty as a citizen detective, I'm going to begin by discussing Kelly Bowling's study of true crime fandom in women who have experienced domestic abuse. This is a paper called Fundamentally Different Stories That Matter. And I'm looking at how this corresponds to Misty's motivations and actions, particularly as an adult, and how these are informed by her experiences as a teenager. A lot of people have already covered that Misty is an extremely complex character, and there are a lot of things about Misty which I am not going to touch on in this, but hopefully I will be able to sort of pick up on some of those complexities by looking at her through this lens. So the first common thread, which is described in Bowling's paper, is one which is identified across her participants, and that's the role of true crime in helping to find a sense of community, and the perceived healing effects that this community offers. So for participants in the study, their experiences often happen in isolation, domestic violence within relationships, and happening inside the home behind closed doors. However, by seeking out true crime communities, those connections are formed, which take something which has been a deeply private and isolated experience and bring a sense of community and connection in a way which isn't possible without that. So it takes the trauma behind these closed doors and stories between people who have shared similar experiences and helps to contextualise those by creating community with shared interests, as well as an understanding of the wider prevalence of abuse against women within society, and feeling like their stories are represented not just within the communities, but within the media they consume and the crime stories which they are listening to or reading. This sense of community is something that I think is a really interesting and important point when looking at Misty. So throughout both the present day and the flashbacks, we see that Misty is an outsider. In this exchange with Jessica, it becomes apparent that she isn't connected to the survivors in the same way as the wider group. And Misty herself, in describing what a citizen detective is, speaks of the citizen detective community, and her engagement with that group is shown to include an active participation and connections with others. So Misty already exists within the group at the point of the crash as an outsider, partly through perhaps her own personality and way of existing in the world, but on a far more literal level, as somebody who is not a member of the team, she exists sort of para to the team. Like the participants in Bowling's study, Misty's interest in the citizen detective community can be seen as a way to create connections and to contextualise her own experiences. She's seeking out stories of suffering and harm, perhaps to better understand her own. But while Bowling's participants may have experienced trauma in private in ways where there was nobody else living that moment with them, Misty's is very different. Obviously, her experiences in the wilderness are unique in that they happen to that group and are not commonly experienced outside of that group. But as an outsider, the connection that the others have with each other is something that she lacks. And perhaps this sense of isolation mirrors the isolating feelings shared by the participants within Bowling's study. The next motivating factor that Bowling identifies within her study is that of true crime as an opportunity to learn survival skills. This is a very common trope among true crime fans and true crime critics alike, with people often talking about needing to understand what motivates criminals and how criminals are able to commit their crimes and to get away with them as a way to avoid becoming a victim of crime, or to know what to do should you find yourself in a situation like that. And so people in Bowling studies talk about listening to these to understand this and to understand the skills that they would need not to become a victim again, or to prevent somebody they love from becoming a victim. A great example of this can be seen with the TikTok response to the disappearance of Gabby Petito, where true crime fans initially in that TikTok response were acting very much as citizen detectives. They were taking the facts that they had available to them and going beyond what they perceived the police and the authorities to be able to do. But within that, a lot of the true crime influence came through, and the citizen detectives came to talk about what they had learned and the survival mechanisms and coping mechanisms that perhaps Gabby Petito may have missed, sharing red flags that they'd identified, looking into her boyfriend to talk about things that they found problematic about him, warning others to be vigilant of such red flags. Red flags like he liked the film Fight Club, or he liked the Joker, or look at his Spotify playlists. And these perhaps seem a little trivial or flippant to some people, but within these types of communities, this sort of information is viewed as giving them one step ahead of people who might cause harm to them and giving them an advantage. And we've already heard from other people on this panel about Misty's ability to remain one or more steps ahead of others. And so in this area, I think there are some correlations with these participants in this study and with Misty as citizen detective. I've got a video here that I'm going to pause because my sound doesn't work. So I'm just going to skip to the next slide on that. Sorry. But the idea of learning survival skills and of using these to be one step ahead, I think after the idea of seeking community is one of the strongest links between Bowling's study and the participants within it and Misty. So Misty says as a teenager in the wilderness that she took the Red Cross babysitters course twice. She is eminently practical and she uses this to her advantage in many ways throughout her time in the wilderness and as an adult. It's apparent that her involvement within the citizen detective communities has offered her a wealth of practical information. But this is where she begins to diverge from the true crime fans within Bowling's study, in the way that she takes this information and applies it not just to surviving as a potential victim, but perhaps learning as a potential perpetrator. She says herself that 12% of murderers are caught buying cleaning supplies. And when they need a body disposed of, Natalie brings Misty into the fold in a way where perhaps she has previously been kept at arm's length. The reactions to inviting Misty along are perhaps those of a question, but it's apparent that she has a wealth of information, no doubt gleaned from the citizen detective community, which she has spoken, which makes her a very useful person to have in this situation. And this type of very practical approach to life is something which is mirrored through citizen detectives, through true crime fandoms, and through a lot of what we see of Misty, even as a teenager. And this is a video from where they're disposing of Adam's body, in which Misty comes along and, very level-headed, is able to offer quite a lot of information about the best approach and organise everybody in a way which speaks not just to her own mental state, but to knowledge that she may have gathered externally as well. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to make the video play, sorry. So the third main area in Bowling's study is validation. So the survivors within the study want to know that their trauma is valid, and the true crime communities and the media with which they're engaging offer a space which is very heavily dominated by women's voices, and it gives a voice to women, and it gives an opportunity for people to share their trauma with others who are very like-minded in that approach. There is a lot of criticism of true crime communities for perhaps being glib in the way that they approach trauma, and for being something which is a preserve of women of a certain age. But this in and of itself speaks to the way that these types of stories are perhaps not validated in wider society, and why these types of communities spring up, and the support and value that they offer for survivors. This is something which comes through quite clearly throughout Bowling's study. Across a number of participants, is finding stories that reassure them, and they give them a sense that they're not alone, that their stories are valid, and they give them some hope of finding a way forward with their lives. And so this, in many ways, is not necessarily laid out as such in Bowling's study, but it does bring together those strands of community and of learning. However, I think that this is perhaps where Misty as citizen detective, and where the true crime fans as domestic abuse survivors deviate, and this relationship between Misty, true crime and trauma becomes somewhat more complicated. So Misty undoubtedly does seek validation, and this is shown long before we reach the point of her as an adult, and long before she helps with the disposal of Adam's body. Her decision to destroy the plane's black box in the wilderness could be perceived as an attempt to prolong validation which she receives by having the skills that she has gained through the Red Cross Babysitters course, and by being a practical person who is able to help in the immediate term after the crash. But doing these things is obviously not something which is wholly unproblematic, and in seeking validation for her own experiences perhaps creates trauma for other people. And this sort of complicating and multifaceted view of true crime is something which I'm going to explore a little further in this second section of the presentation. So looking at the impacts of citizen detectives. So Emma Berquist is herself a survivor of an unprovoked assault by a stranger. She's written extensively about true crime, and she says herself that she was a former true crime fan, but since her assault has begun to look at this somewhat differently. She talks about the way that this type of media can negatively impact people, and the way that the heightened emotion and anxiety of true crime is actually detrimental to psychological well-being. So rather than offering opportunities to learn valuable skills or to create communities, as these things may do on the surface, and indeed for many people genuinely do offer, there is another layer to this, in which becoming invested in these types of narratives feeds anxiety and paranoia, and it breaks down bonds of trust. Berquist herself states that true crime runs on heightened emotion and fear. It convinces people, especially women, that every stranger is a possible murderer. If women are advised to trust their instincts, how can they do that when they've been hijacked by induced anxiety? And I think this speaks a lot to some of the more challenging aspects of Misty's relationship with the citizen detective community, and the things that she has learned from that being put into practice in ways which are wholly unhealthy and harmful. If you're living with the trauma of having survived the wilderness, then you're already going to be in a heightened state of anxiety, and feeding into that further with knowledge that you can then use to help with the disposal of a body, or with poisoning cigarettes, is perhaps an example of where this type of knowledge is damaging rather than healing. So Misty's instincts, both in the wilderness and in the present day, are clearly heavily impacted by anxiety and trauma. And you do have to ask yourself whether she would know how to poison a cigarette or dispose of a body so effectively without assistant detectives, and without the work that she has done and the research and the community that she has formed there. Moreover, after disposing of Adam's body in particular, Shauna, Thaisa and Natalie are all visibly shaken in their own ways. And they all respond to this differently, but there is a common thread that it's something which has deeply affected them. Meanwhile, Misty remains extremely calm. How much of this can be attributed to Misty's own personality to begin with is unclear, but there is definitely research to show that true crime media and exposure to this can ultimately desensitize people to trauma. And perhaps in a situation where you've experienced the type of trauma that Misty has, being desensitized is ultimately part of your end goal, but it can also separate you from people around you and break down those communities that you may have sought out or perceived to have found through the initial involvement. Furthermore, research from psychologist Emma Kenny shows that involvement with true crime media, and therefore I'm extending this to citizen detectives as an activity, can actually support and entrench moral opinions very firmly. And so if you already have a sense that what you have done is right, and that what somebody else has done is wrong, then it can further divide that and create more challenging situations. So Misty's involvement with the disposal of Adam's body, for example, comes from a place of wanting to protect her friends, arguably, and understanding that that is what is right. So having this further entrenched through the citizen detective model is an example of where this is actually something which is harmful to society and to the individual involved. So, sorry, I'm just going to check my slides. So through Misty as, thank you, as citizen detective, Yellowjackets offers an insight into the complexities and multitudes of the relationship between trauma and true crime, while also using the model of the citizen detective to highlight the complexities of Misty as a character. Two of the most popular pieces of true crime media in recent years have also highlighted the duality of true crime brain, as I'm terming it, with Joe Pans asking at the end of Don't Fuck With Cats whether they have actually created a monster or made things better, ultimately saying you don't want to become the monster. And My Favourite Murder, an extremely popular but often criticised true crime podcast, has also made a point of saying let's use our powers of anxiety for good and not for evil. So whether Misty is using her anxieties for good or evil is unclear. Killing Jessica, disposing of Adam's body, are prima facie not good actions, but the motivations behind them, protecting the other survivors and perhaps being a good friend, certainly aren't evil either. In this way, Misty encapsulates many of the messy and difficult issues with citizen detectives and with true crime, and in turn they reflect her own messy contradictions in many ways themselves. And this is a quote from Sarah Marshall on the You're Wrong About True Crime episode, which says that these narratives want to put endings to stories that don't have endings because life is messy. And I think that the way that Misty as a character develops and her role as a assistant detective very much exemplifies that as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All right. A huge thank you to all of our panelists for fascinating papers there. The Q&A section of the panel is now open, so please do leave your questions in the chat. If you could also indicate if you're happy to ask a question or if you'd like me to ask it on your behalf, that would be fantastic. Alternatively, you can raise your hand as well, if that's easier for you. Let me have a look. Let me actually put my glasses on so I can see. I mean, they're really smudgy, so I can still barely see, but okay, hang on 1 second. All right, Vincent, I think you're first in there. Did you want to jump on?
Hello, am I coming through?
You are.
Excellent, excellent. Right, well, thank you for really provocative and inspiring papers. My question is for Simon, although it might well relate to what some of the other speakers spoke to as well. Simon, you drew a lot of attention to the editing in Yellowjackets to illustrate temporal disruption of trauma. Now it's a device that gets used to depict male trauma as well. Christopher Nolan uses it in Memento, Inception, Batman Begins. It's there throughout the Jason Bourne series. It's used in the X-Men series, Wolverine, and so being used to express the trauma of men. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about what you think is distinctly female about the expression of trauma through non-linear time in Yellowjackets.
Yeah, sure. I can give it a go with the caveat that I am a cis white man who's, probably unqualified to talk about women's trauma, really. But I think what Yellowjackets and some other expressions of women's trauma do that distinguishes it from the kind of films that you've mentioned is the emphasis on the collective. So whereas a lot of these films that you mentioned are focused on the individual, I'll highlight specifically Batman and Jason Bourne, which both have the name of the man in the title. The use of non-linear time in other more women-focused things also does focus on kind of collective responses, particularly in like Yellowjackets, which flows seamlessly from one character to another. We'll focus on the temporality of one character and then go into the temporality of the group and have these kinds of collective responses, which I think highlights the kind of collective nature of women's trauma, rather than the kind of individualized trauma of male protagonists. As I'm saying this, I'm realizing this is undermined by my focus on Jackie and Spencer, which both focus on individual women, but there we are.
Well, thank you. I think that's really, that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you very much. All right, we've got a question here from Mo, from James Rendell. Can you read it? Yes, I certainly can. Brilliant paper. I wonder what Mo thought about what seems to be the commercialization of trauma, the journalistic investigation by Jessica, the published book on the crash that Adam reads, the woman offering support to Ty if she tells what really happened, and people like Ali, who as an adult wants to align herself with the survivors, and how this impacts on the real experienced trauma of our characters. Oh, we can't hear you.
Would help if I turn my mute off. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you so much for that question. Actually, it's something that I wanted to dive deeper into, but I also wanted to be cognizant of time with this. So I'm glad you're asking this. What's interesting about this is societally, you can see all of them. I mean, obviously, I just going to go from the unauthorized biography that Adam has in his little stash as Shauna comes to inadvertently end his life. We have that really voracious capacity to really want to know. To Helen's previous point, we've really become desensitized to other people's trauma. I mean, we slow down when there's a crash. We classify something as a train wreck because people stand and we stare at it. So there has been such a commercialization on a societal aspect of where it's not affecting me, so I can kind of paw and dig at it and learn all I need to. I mean, if you think about where news outlets will spend an entire hour, we have like 48 hours, we have Dateline, we have Snap, we have all of those programs that focus for hours on traumatic events and trauma of people, of either violent acts, violent deaths. And then we have the 2-minute good news segment at the end of our news hour, because we don't really want to spend that much on good news. We're really voracious about the bad news. So to kind of really answer your point, it's more on where the people that are surrounding this group of women are very desensitized to their trauma. It's really, like I said at the top of my paper, it's really about how it affects the victim and what it means for us. Like, we want to be in the know. We want to be close. We have the, the woman who, the huge donor that Thaisa runs into. She has her, you know, oh, I will do this if you let me into what really happened up there. And she feels like she has Thaisa in a corner, which Thaisa obviously kind of gets rid of that aspect of it. But to your point of with Allie, I feel like we've all seen somebody who likes to be death adjacent. We've seen it with a lot of people. Take any funeral where you have people that are at the calling hours or at the funeral where it's like, I know personally, this person has not talked to this dead person in about 5 years. And we kind of keep that under our hat, but people like to be death adjacent. And I don't know if it is a way of for them to process their grief where they have guilt about not keeping in contact with this individual, or it's aligning themselves with, you should also feel sorry for me too, because I knew this person. So just from one of my personal experiences with that, one of my best friends in the world used to be a really, really great friend of Jonathan Lawson, who created Rent. And when Jonathan died, people came out of the woodwork in droves to attend his funeral to be death adjacent. So I really feel like that's where Allie really, that's where her identity lies. She doesn't really have much outside of that. I mean, we see her as, you know, the quintessential Jersey girl, and no offense to Jersey, I used to live there. I quite love Jersey. But she is the, you know, the Jersey girl who has, you know, the accent and the tight clothes and the over stylized hair. You know, she is exactly where they left her. And she hasn't really blossomed much. So in order for her to raise her status or have a little spotlight on her, she has to be death adjacent in order to survive in the Yellowjackets world. So I think the commercialization of trauma, 100%, we do it all the time. And for Allie's instance, there's not one of us that doesn't know someone who really loves to be death adjacent. Hopefully that answered your question.
Definitely. I mean, I used to work as a funeral director, and I know when you say, you know, people that want to be death adjacent, I know exactly what you mean. The people that come in, you're like, All right, so I've got another question for you, Mo, from Vicky Brewster. And Vicky asks, what do you think of the portrayals of therapy in Yellowjackets? In particular, Nat seems to be the only adult character who engages in therapy, rehab, AA meetings, however seriously she does or doesn't take them. Yet she seems to be the most effed up character, without a family or a home or stability. Also, Ty being dismissive of her son seeing a quote unquote shrink despite paying for Nat to go through rehab.
Those are really great observations. And it really goes back to these women's trauma responses. And I talked about them earlier, where Natalie is very escapist. So you have Nat in rehab and she's incorporating X, Y, and Z, and she's doing the whole Zen thing. And now it's group therapy time. And now we're going to chat. She's kind of playing a lot. She's phoning it in. I mean, in all intents and purposes, she's not really engaged in it. And the thing about with Natalie in therapy, she's doing what she feels is the structure created for her by Thaisa. She feels that she needs that structure. She is the only one that's a little bit rudderless when all of this happens. She doesn't have a huge support system at home. Her mother blames her for her father's accidental death. She's not really maternal at all. So she already comes with no structure at all. So I think she does not really view the rehab as an actual help or recovery place. It gives her a sense of structure. The minute she gets out of rehab, she's completely unstructured. Stays at a steedy motel. She makes plans to just kind of drive 3 hours to figure out where Travis is. She gets really tunnel visions, and you can tell immediately that when she's out of that structure, she's reckless. So for her, she's not really incorporating anything she's really learning in rehab, right? She's goes out and has a drink with Misty. She sleeps with Kevin. She buys like bottles and bottles of whiskey. She's being really self-destructive without that structure. So for her, therapy doesn't really mean a whole hell of a lot. But to Thaisa's point, Thaisa being avoidant, she does not want to look like she has problems. She does not want her family to look like they have problems. She needs to have it absolutely all together. So there is no question that she has survived mentally and emotionally. So with her son acting out or drawing the pictures of the woman in the tree, it's shaking her belief system up a little bit. If he goes to therapy, people are going to equate that with me, and then they're going to wonder what's wrong with me. and then I'm going to get more scrutiny. So of course she's going to scrutinize helping her son, with really to the detriment of her own child, so she can keep the status quo, or she can keep the eyes off of her. And even, even though you did not address Misty or Shauna, but Shauna really internalizes a lot. She feels like she is her own therapist. If she just kind of owns it and understands it and slowly works through it, where she keeps all of her diaries, and that's kind of where she silently works through it, she doesn't feel like she needs therapy. We all know Misty's not going to therapy. Let's be honest. She's just not. She has it all together and she's got it all figured out. And yes, I had to do this to survive and whatever. Now I've incorporated skills for my lifetime. That's kind of how she sees it. But I think with Natalie, she's not incorporating what she needs to. She needs the structure, and Thaisa really needs to seem like she really has her stuff all together.
Yeah, interesting. All right, I see there is another question there, but I'm going to skip over it. And I'll come back to it in a second. I have another question from Vicky, this time for Helen. Do you think the narrative towards the end of season 1 of Yellowjackets is suggesting a destabilization of Misty's capabilities? For example, Adam has been identified as a missing person, and she incorrectly says bodies are identified by heads and hands in the age of DNA profiling. And she also becomes highly distrusted in the 90s timeline following the Doomcoming Shrooms incident.
Hi, I think there's a couple of things there. I think the first is, if we're looking at the modern timeline, the habit of true crime and the like to convince people that they can be prepared for eventualities that they cannot be prepared for would definitely lend itself to that sort of destabilizing effect happening. Things like my favorite murder saying stay sexy and don't get murdered, when that's not a thing that you can be prepared for. But if you immerse yourself in enough knowledge, I think it can actually lend itself to you being more likely to become destabilized, because there's a complacency that comes with thinking that you know more about things, and that's potentially one thing. More generally, the sort of destabilizing in the earlier timeline, I don't feel that she was ever especially trusted anyway. I feel like that's something has gone wrong there, but I don't know how stable any of that was. I think trying to maintain control would only ever get her so far with that particular group of people at that point in time. So I'm not sure. I don't know how I'll have addressed that, but yeah.
Fair enough. And a little follow-up question related to that as well. I was wondering if the creators kind of put the audience in Ali's shoes. It encourages us to be morbid in our theorizing and obsession with the details of what really happened. And I don't know if that's for Helen specifically or for everybody, but it seems to lead on from that one quite nicely. So
I think something that I thought about including, but I was very conscious of time, is that, yeah, I think across all media and not just where it's true crime, this type of fascination with things has become more and more prevalent. And I think particularly with narratives that examine like coming of age and girlhood and womanhood and trauma, I think there's a lot of overlap between the types of audiences that Yellowjackets would appeal to and the types of audiences that are very common among true crime fandoms. And I think it's entirely possible that there's an intended sort of audience surrogate taking you into that type of mindset with this.
Oh, all right. Question for Sheila from Lindsay. I loved your comment about how they don't just survive, they create their own order and culture. They find their power through becoming monsters. How does the present day storyline show the impossibility of ever really returning from this?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and then something I hope to expand on in writing more about it. In a way, I think it's impossible for them to return because in a lot of ways, people won't let them. Everybody constantly asks, but what really happened? What really happened? Everybody throughout their lives has always asked them, especially if you're Thaisa and you're in the public eye. Presumably she's been on the public eye before we meet her, running for state senate. She had to have had some sort of public profile. So in a way, nobody will let them move on from that. Shauna, they try in their way. Shauna through retreating into domestic, Tysa by just being completely ambitious, Misty just being who she is. But nobody lets them move on. Nobody lets them, in a sense, and they also also hold themselves back because they don't. Shauna has her journaling, but that's not therapy in a way that's really going to help her. Tysa doesn't do anything. Misty thrives on being who she is, and Natalie is completely effed up. So they do it to themselves, but and what we see is because of them, what happens to them with Lottie, presumably, as we learn at the end of the first season, coming back and invading their lives. It's like, no, they're never going to get out. It's like in The Talented Mr. Ripley, when Tom says, I'm never getting out of the basement. They're never getting out of the wilderness, not really, because it's a place, it's a site that it's what happened to them was so terrible. It's the place that they can, in a sense, never leave, partly because it was so terrible, but also partly because nobody lets them. It's their identity is so much based on that, for better or for worse. Because I think I said something there, but yeah, it's something I'd like to explore by looking more at, like, taking this idea I have and applying it more to the contemporary timeline.
Cool. All right, I've got another one for Mo. So this is from Laura Me, one of our organisers. So Mo, you mentioned the sensitivity with which some speakers have addressed trauma today. And I was wondering how this compares to any observations you have of more general discussion about the show. We've talked a lot about fandom and a bit about broader audience or critical reception. Have you seen any particularly sensitive or accurate interpretations of trauma in the show's reception?
Yeah, there's been a little bit of good and bad where, and I think mostly the reactions I've seen is just in comparison of the reactions from people that are in a therapy space or going to therapy, or just, and I don't want to say layman, that's not the topic, that's not the term that I want to use, but people that are kind of outside that arena where they're saying, like, what does it take that long to recover? This seems a little excessive. This is really not true to what should be happening to somebody. And I think it's a little bit been insensitive to the fact that we're not really clear. Really, point of my paper is for us to be a little bit more clear with how reactivity is in real life to trauma, because we've seen it happen to kind of all of us. Like I said, we're all in the trauma Olympics, right? Everybody tries to quantify, this happened to me, so it was not as bad as what happened to you. And I think in the show, especially with the society that they're running into, how are you still going through this? Why haven't you said, wouldn't you feel better if you unloaded what really happened? And I think the sensitivity piece that I'm really seeing has been great, because we're really trying to focus on women's trauma in this show. And it's really been kind of overlooked. We've had some really terrible tropes of women's traumatic experiences in movies. I mean, the one that I always see in not necessarily just American cinema is sexual assault, quick montage, boom, vigilante. Like, that's not how it works. That's not how trauma actually works. So I love how the sensitivity piece here is based on each woman's individual reactivity, and that is being really sensitive to what really happens to individual people going through. And as to how this ends up being more of a female focused trauma, as opposed to, just to kind of touch on the question that was asked earlier, is that how does this differ from male trauma? I mean, society, men are allowed to kind of work through their trauma either in violence and outbursts, in actually action. Women are taught society-wise to minimize and delineate and be quiet about it. So you have 4 women who've experienced a collective trauma that have to suppress exactly what they're going through for society to be okay with it. So that's kind of where we're seeing in this really great depiction of that sensitivity has been a really big piece for me as a therapist, to be like, somebody is finally getting it, because there has been a lot of insensitivity to it, where it's like, couldn't have been that bad. What's wrong with this? It's been a little hard to digest. And there was like a whole thread which I feel like there always is when there's a women's show involved of, you know, collective of some men that are just like, dumb show, didn't like it. Oh, everybody's really sad. It's kind of stupid. We get to allow this space to happen for that. But hopefully this is answering your question. I feel like I'm circling the airport a little bit, but I feel like we're getting really decent reception on it because of the sensitivity that's been shown to each character in that aspect in the research, and how that really, and to Ashley Lyle's point that Simon had made earlier, that it really wanted to come from a personal place and not a clinical place. It didn't want to be like, this happens, then this, then this, then this, and this begets this, and then these who are the characters are, and it's nothing else. Every single thing affects their response system. So, you know, with Thaisa's son going into therapy, that's going to ruin her perfect image. With, you know, Shauna having to really go into overdrive and make sure everything is okay, she has to deal with Adam. So everything kind of shakes up these women's way they've been dealing with this for the last 25 years, which speaks to the personal level of it. So I think media is being a little bit more sensitive about it, and the more we can output that, we'll see a lot less of those forums that are out there saying shows on women's trauma are stupid.
Okay. Did any of the other panelists want to speak to that last question? Because there was a lot there to digest. So
yeah, just to pick up on what Mo just said terrifically. I think Yellowjackets, the kind of present timeline, is about showing how the women live with their trauma. It's not about showing their trauma as such. It is about showing them living lives, you know, with their trauma, suffering with their trauma, going through their lives, having to deal with it, but leading rich, fulfilling lives nonetheless. And I think that's really important, especially for women being such a big community for trauma because of systems of patriarchy.